My name is Adam and I am 22 years old. I am a student of art history and for as long as I can remember, I have always been fascinated by antiques. When I saw an old television in an antique shop, something about it caught my attention. It was beautifully decorated with intricate carvings on its wooden casing. The seller, an elderly man with a piercing gaze and a mysterious, almost demonic smile, approached me. Without asking, he shook my hand, and I immediately noticed that it was as cold as ice.
This television has a dark past,
he whispered, his voice resembling the rustle of dry leaves.
Its previous owner disappeared under mysterious circumstances and, as far as I know, was never found. The strangest thing is that this man's neighbors saw him enter his apartment, but they never saw him leave.
His words filled me with unease, but I ultimately decided to ignore the feeling. A moment later, I bought the television with the thought of decorating my room. At home, out of pure curiosity, I decided to see if it worked. When I turned it on, the screen began to flicker with a red, hypnotic light. Fascinated, I stepped closer. The light seemed to pulsate, drawing me into a trance. Suddenly, I felt as if the room began to spin. The walls started to ripple and blur, and I had the sensation that I was falling into an endless abyss. Colors swirled around me, creating a surreal kaleidoscope. I felt my body being torn apart and reassembled. A terrifying noise emerged, as if hundreds of voices were whispering incomprehensible words. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the chaos. Suddenly, everything went silent. The light went out and I fell onto cold, hard ground. I woke up in a completely different world. When I looked around, I saw that I had landed in some kind of village. At first glance, it resembled an ordinary human settlement. Houses, roads, even fields. But I quickly realized that something was wrong. There was a strange, sweet smell in the air, and the silence was unnatural, interrupted only by a distant murmur. Around me circled humanoid animals, each walking on two legs and dressed like people. Their appearance was grotesque and terrifying. Closest to me stood a sheep. Its skin was rough and cracked, resembling dried, dead tissue with patches of dirty, tangled wool. Its eyes were large, black, and expressionless, and sharp teeth protruded from its mouth, completely out of place with its originally gentle appearance. Next to it I saw a dog, massive, with a muscular body covered in short, dirty fur. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its mouth, full of sharp teeth, seemed always ready to attack. Saliva dripped from its jaws, mixing with the remnants of its victim's blood. In the distance, I noticed an elephant, enormous, with dead eyes and skin covered in scars and wounds. Its tusks were frighteningly long and sharp, and its whole body emanated brutal strength. It looked like it had the power to destroy anything in its path. The animals began to approach, and I felt my heart race. With each passing second, their steps grew louder and panic overwhelmed me. Suddenly, I bolted, running along a narrow, winding path between the houses. I heard the sounds of pursuit behind me, heavy steps growling and hissing. Each step on the muddy ground was a struggle, and the air, thick with humidity, made it hard to breathe. Fear paralyzed my body, making every movement a true fight for survival. At one point, I tripped over my own legs and landed in a puddle of mud. When I lifted my head, I saw an enormous humanoid pig in front of me. It was even larger and more terrifying than the other animals. Its skin was thick and covered in layers of mud, and its eyes shone with a wild, malevolent light. Huge tusks protruded from its mouth, and its hands, or rather paws, ended in sharp claws. Upon seeing me, the pig's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The pig leaned over me, its foul, decaying breath washing over my face, causing me to feel nauseous.
I hate it when someone interrupts my mud puddle jumping.
It said in a low, guttural voice that sounded like dirty water bubbling. Its paws, ending in long, dirty claws, reached out towards me. I tried to get up, but my body refused to obey. I felt cold, stinking mud seeping into my mouth and nose, making it hard to breathe. Fear wrapped around me like an icy blanket, and my heart pounded wildly. As the pig approached to grab me, I noticed its huge tusks glistening with sticky, wet saliva dripping from its gaping jaws. I felt something warm trickle down the inside of my thigh. The terror had paralyzed me so much that I couldn't stop the reflex. The world before my eyes flickered with silvery spots, and the sounds around me grew increasingly muffled. The pig let out a low, guttural laugh. The last thing I saw were its inhuman, wild eyes full of cruel satisfaction. I was losing consciousness, feeling as if I were sinking into the mud that was swallowing me deeper and deeper. Darkness enveloped me like a thick, impenetrable veil, and I stopped fighting, surrendering to my inevitable fate. I woke up tied to a chair in a dark, damp kitchen. My wrists and ankles were tightly bound with thick rope, and every movement caused a searing pain. The air was thick with the smell of cooked meat and spices, only intensifying my nausea. In front of me stood a table, around which sat a family of pigs: Daddy Pig, Mummy Pig, their daughter Peppa, and son George. Their faces were grotesque, their smiles wide, and their eyes glinted with malicious intelligence. On the table lay various dishes that at first glance might have seemed normal, but I quickly realized they were made from human bodies. There were roasted hands, carefully arranged on silver trays, with crispy skin and fingers that looked as if they could move at any moment. A deep bowl of soup contained what looked like human eyeballs floating in a thick red broth. In the middle of the table was a large salad bowl, which besides vegetables contained pieces of muscle and skin, meticulously chopped into pieces. Daddy Pig looked at me with a smile that revealed his sharp yellow teeth.
Welcome, our new guest.
He said, his voice deep and booming.
You're lucky to be alive. Our daughter Peppa wanted you to be her new pet. Her previous pet died after her little brother George threw it into a pot of boiling water.
Peppa looked at me with her big eyes full of strange childlike joy.
You'll be my pet,
she said enthusiastically, clapping her hands. Daddy Pig continued.
In our world, humans are the main source of food. We breed them on special farms, and then their butchered parts are distributed to supermarkets. As long as you're obedient, nothing will happen to you. But you have to eat the same food as we do. If you refuse, well, then we'll eat you. So, what will it be?
Daddy Pig tried to feed me a piece of roasted meat that looked like a human leg. My heart pounded wildly, and I was overwhelmed with disgust and panic. Tears welled up in my eyes from fear as I tried to turn my head away from the horrifying sight. Suddenly, I heard the doorbell ring. Daddy Pig rose, somewhat irritated, and went to see who it was. The kitchen fell into a moment of silence, interrupted only by Mummy Pig's heavy breathing and Peppa's giggles as she played with her fork. The door opened with a loud creak, and Granddad Pig and Granny Pig entered.
We heard rumors that there's a wild man in your house,
Granny Pig said, looking towards the kitchen with interest.
Yes, it's true.
Daddy Pig replied, leading them to the table.
Our Peppa has a new pet.
At that moment, George approached me. His face was twisted in a sinister smile, and his eyes gleamed with a strange light. Suddenly, to my surprise, he began untying my ropes.
Run!
He whispered, his voice filled with eerie delight. As soon as the ropes fell away, I didn't wait a second. Taking advantage of the confusion, I stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. Daddy Pig turned, but I was already on the move. I ran through the kitchen, bumping into obstacles and overturning furniture. I ran down a narrow corridor where the walls were covered with pictures of the pig family, grotesque portraits depicting their joyful moments of hunting humans. Moonlight streamed through a small window, casting eerie shadows on the floor. My heart pounded in my ears, and my breath became increasingly ragged. Finally, I reached a door on the other side of the building. I opened it violently, almost tearing it off its hinges, and ran outside. The cool, damp night air hit my face, bringing momentary relief. I ran down the hill along a narrow, muddy path, ignoring the branches scratching my body and the stones hurting my feet. Behind me, I heard screams and the sounds of pursuit. Granddad Pig was shouting, and Peppa and Mummy Pig were squealing in terror. George stood in the doorway, his sinister laugh echoing in the darkness. I ran down the steep slope when suddenly I slipped on the mud. I lost my balance and began sliding down like down a chute. Before I could do anything, I fell into a deep hole. I fell heavily onto something soft and sticky. When I got up, I realized I had landed among human remains, bodies in various stages of decomposition, bones covered in remnants of flesh and old clothes. The pale moon, shrouded by clouds, cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance over the scattered bones. The stench was unbearable, and the air was thick with the smell of rotting meat and death. The sight made me want to vomit. However, if I wanted to survive, I had to act quickly. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. I heard heavy footsteps approaching, interspersed with the sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves. Peppa's terrifying squeals, mixed with Daddy Pig's low, booming voice, drilled into my ears. Each step seemed closer, and my heart pounded like crazy.
Find him!
Roared Daddy Pig, his voice echoing through the forest.
He can't be far!
I heard Mummy Pig, whose voice, though calmer, sounded ominous.
Search every bush, every hole. We must find him.
Peppa was running around. Her steps were quick and light.
He must be here somewhere. I want my pet.
She screamed. The steps were getting closer, and I knew I didn't have much time. In desperation, I began to cover myself with the rotting bodies, piling them on top of me until I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding wildly, and my hands were shaking with disgust and fear. But I had to endure. It was my only chance to survive. I heard the steps stop right above the hole.
Check here,
Commanded Daddy Pig. The steps were now directly above my head, and the rotting bodies started to move as if someone was tossing them around.
There's nothing here.
George shouted, his voice filled with clear disappointment. Suddenly, through a gap between the bodies, I saw George looking straight at me. His small, sharp eyes gleamed in the dark. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. My heart was pounding wildly, and I was convinced that my fate was sealed. But to my astonishment, George winked at me conspiratorially, and the corners of his mouth lifted in a slightly sinister smile.
There's nothing here.
He repeated louder, turning his gaze away and pretending to search elsewhere.
We've checked thoroughly. We can move on.
Daddy Pig grumbled in dissatisfaction but waved his hand, signaling to move on.
All right, let's go. We need to search the rest of the forest.
The steps receded, and I still lay motionless, listening until the sounds completely disappeared. Only then did I dare to move. Still hidden under the rotting bodies, I tried to understand why George had spared me. His sinister smile and wink suggested he had his reasons, but I knew they weren't good. Maybe he wanted to play a more terrifying game with me, or he had another, even darker plan. Slowly, very slowly, I began to dig my way out from under the rotting bodies, making each movement with the utmost caution. Despite this, the rotting corpses and old bones shifted due to my actions, emitting sounds that resembled cracks and creaks. I slid over wet, slippery surfaces, and my hands fell into sticky pools of blood and other fluids. In the darkness, I saw something glinting, an old blood-stained notebook. It was soaked with blood and dirt, and its pages were wrinkled and torn. I opened it, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. I discovered that its previous owner had described their terrifying experiences in this world. Each word was saturated with fear and despair, and the entries ended abruptly, as if the author had been suddenly interrupted. They described the breeding of humans like animals, macabre meals and tortures that were part of everyday life in this horrifying world. I realized that I had to continue this horrifying work so that maybe someone someday would understand what was happening here, and to ensure that the previous owner's sacrifice was not in vain. When I finally surfaced, I breathed in the fresh air with relief. Exhausted but determined, I looked in the direction I had come from. Then I noticed the hill where Peppa's house stood. In the moonlight, its silhouette was sharply etched against the night sky. The walls were covered in moss and moisture, and the roof seemed to be sagging under the weight of years and the secrets it held. Along the slope of the hill grew old, deformed trees, their branches reaching for the sky like bony hands trying to grasp the stars. Their tangled roots formed a network of traps, and every step on the ground was a risk of tripping over something hidden in the darkness. Between the trees were trodden paths leading to various corners of this eerie estate. The ground was full of mud, and scattered bones lay along the paths, gleaming in the moonlight. On the slope of the hill, in less visible places, stood old, rusty farm tools, scythes, pitchforks, and shovels, which looked as if they had been used for more sinister purposes than just farming. They seemed to be witnesses to the macabre events that had taken place on this hill. The wind emitted low wailing sounds that resembled the quiet wailing of souls trapped in this hellish place. I turned my back on the terrifying pig estate and started to walk away. I plunged into the darkness of the forest, knowing that I had to find shelter before I was captured again. The sounds of the night surrounded me from all sides, and in my mind I still had images of the rotting bodies and the smell of death that wouldn't leave me for a moment. I knew I had to find a way to survive in this macabre world. At that moment, that was the only thing that mattered to me.